The Forgotten Eight, the genesis of defiance. The year was 1942. The world was on fire, not with the cleansing flame of renewal, but with the choking smoke of total war. Cities burned, monuments crumbled, and the great oceans, once pathways of trade, now rumbled with the endless, terrifying violence of iron ships. Young men who once dreamed of ordinary lives, of mortgages, first dances, and quiet Sundays, now found themselves strapping into cramped cockpits, flying straight into the jaws of death. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. That day, America was not just attacked, it was wounded. It was broken but not defeated. From that trauma, a radical, desperate plan was born, a plan not of cold strategy, but of sheer, unbridled defiance. The idea was audacious, almost suicidal. 16 heavily loaded B-25 Mitchell bombers, aircraft designed for land runways, would be launched from the deck of a single, pitching aircraft carrier, the USS Hornet. Their mission was to strike the Japanese mainland. It was a mission designed not for victory, not to cripple the enemy's war machine, but purely for a message, a psychological shot across the bow, a message thundering across the Pacific. America will fight back. They called it a one-way mission. The physics were brutally simple. Fully fueled to reach Japan, the bombers would have too little gas to return to the carrier. Their only hope was to fly on, attempt to reach the friendly airfields of nationalist China, thousands of miles away. Every man who climbed into those aluminum shells knew one truth with absolute certainty. They were not expected to come home. The odds were astronomical. Yet when the call for volunteers went out, 80 men stepped forward. 80 men, knowing the journey ended in death or capture, volunteered anyway. Among the 80 were 8 ordinary Americans whose names history, in its haste, almost let slip away. They were the flight crew of the final bomber, Ship 16. Captain Jack Turner, the pilot and unflappable leader from Texas. Lieutenant Samuel Carter, the co-pilot, a quiet intellectual from Boston. Staff Sergeant William Hayes, the engineer, hands of steel and a knack for keeping the old birds flying. Corporal Daniel Reed, the bombardier, a farm boy tasked with the most crucial drop. Sergeant Thomas Brooks, a gunner, forever fiddling with his M2 machine gun. Navigator Eli Parker, the one man holding the map that dictated their fate. Gunner Henry Ward, the tail gunner watching the Pacific disappear behind them. Radio operator Michael Dawson, a young man from Chicago who loved jazz, now only listening to static. Different men from different towns, united by a willingness to pay the ultimate cost. Fate would bind them together forever in a shared destiny of courage and silence. The flight of no return. The launch day was chaos. The USS Hornet, miles from the planned launch point due to early detection, pitched violently in a monstrous Pacific storm. Roaring winds and towering waves crashed over the flight deck. They were forced to take off 10 hours early and 200 miles short of their target. Against all protocol, the men crammed themselves into their B-25s. The propellers began to churn, spitting rain and sea spray. One by one, they thundered down the rain-slicked deck, fighting the forces of nature and gravity. Turner's aircraft, the final bomber, roared to life. With a terrifying lurch, it dropped off the bow, dipped precariously low, and then clawed its way into the gray sky. Behind them, the endless, indifferent Pacific. Ahead, enemy skies and a mission no one believed they would survive. They flew low beneath the Japanese radar, skimming the wavetops like ghosts. The stress of the mission was compounded by the cramped, freezing, noise-filled confines of the bomber. For hours, they spoke only in clipped, necessary commands. Every drop of fuel was precious, every hour a victory. Their target, Tokyo. Bombs fell, fire rose, air raid alarms wailed across the astonished capital. Japan for the first time felt the war reach its shores. The effect was immediate, shattering the myth of their invulnerability. The message was delivered, but the victory was short-lived. The extra 200 miles meant the impossible had become the inevitable. There wasn't enough fuel to make it to safety in China. The weather had worsened again. One by one, the radios fell silent. One by one, the bombers disappeared into the vast darkness and storm, scattered across occupied China. Captain Turner's B-25, Ship 16, sputtered, stalled, and slammed into the treacherous, mountainous terrain deep inside occupied territory. The impact was violent. The survivors, the 8 men, crawled from the wreckage. Broken bones, bleeding cuts, exhausted beyond description, but miraculously alive. They stood in a world that was suddenly silent, save for the rain. Alive. For now. Their immediate mission was over. Their new mission was simply survival. They hid in abandoned fields, living off rainwater, meager roots, and what little emergency rations they had salvaged. They moved only under the shroud of night. But the Japanese army spread like a hunting pack. Within days they were discovered, surrounded, captured, dragged away at gunpoint. Their names were changed from American airmen to prisoners of war. And in 1942, being a prisoner of war in Japanese territory was not survival. It was a sentence. Blindfolded and bound, they were transported over hundreds of miles to the infamous Shanghai military prison. The walls were not made of brick and mortar. They were made of fear. There were no uniforms here, no international rules, no humanity. Only cells that smelled like death and stone walls that had heard too many screams. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. They were systematically broken down, starved, beaten, interrogated endlessly, day and night, for information they barely possessed. Who planned the attack? How many more bombers are coming? Where will America strike next? They said nothing. The men who once fought with bombs in the skies now fought a quiet, internal war. They fought to hold on to silence. War is not ultimately won on battlefields with tanks and planes. It is won in the silent, agonizing endurance of men who refuse to break. But even silence had a cost. Captain Jack Turner, the pilot, took the worst of it, targeted as the leader, beaten until he could no longer stand or speak. Sergeant Hayes had his fingernails torn out during relentless questioning about their mechanics. Michael Dawson, the young radio operator who loved jazz, lost his voice entirely from endless choking and water interrogations. And yet, through the starvation and the physical agony, not one of them gave up a single American military secret. Deep inside those prison walls, hope became dangerous. Hope made you weak. So the men held on to something else. The only thing they had left, each other. Every night they used the only communication possible. They tapped messages through the thick, cold walls. Not sentences, not grand plans, just small, defiant reminders. I'm still here. Stay alive. Don't break. The final verdict. Months passed in the gray, suffocating darkness. The 8 men were ghosts, their bodies emaciated, their spirits tested to the limit. Then came the chilling news delivered with cold, bureaucratic malice. The Japanese government, furious over the unexpected attack and desperate to deter any future attempts, declared the airmen not prisoners of war, not soldiers, following military codes, but war criminals. Their punishment, sanctioned at the highest level, death. No trial, no defense, no mercy. 4 men were chosen for immediate execution by firing squad. The leaders, the ones who had endured the most: Jack Turner, William Hayes, Henry Ward, Samuel Carter. On the last night before the execution, in a moment of unimaginable gravity, the guards allowed the condemned a single, final piece of paper and a pencil stub. They wrote, "Not for revenge, not for protest, but for goodbye," a final testament. "Tell my mother I wasn't afraid." Carter, "If I had to choose again, I would still fly." "It was worth the cost." Turner, "War takes everything, but it never took my soul." Hayes. They were executed at dawn. No graves, no markers. Just 4 bodies swallowed by foreign, hostile soil. 4 lights extinguished. 4 silent voices joining the annals of forgotten heroes. The remaining 4, Reed, Brooks, Parker, Dawson, were not granted the swift release of death. They were sent to solitary iron cages, where they lingered for months more. They became shadows, barely alive, barely human. Some days they prayed for rescue, other days and they simply prayed for the end. The survivors vow, But then something changed. The cold grip of the war began to loosen. The war turned. News filtered through whispers and rumors. Japan was losing. The Allies were advancing. The nightmare prison suddenly grew quieter. Guards disappeared. Orders changed. The sense of absolute eternal despair began to crack. Then one morning, with a terrible, grinding screech, the steel doors of their solitary cages opened. They were free. What walked out of that prison were not the same men who had entered. They were survivors, the last of the forgotten eight. When they finally miraculously returned home to America, there were no parades, no cheering crowds. Their story was deemed too sensitive, too horrific. It was hidden, classified, buried under military silence for decades. But the survivors remembered the promise they had tapped on the cold prison walls to their fallen comrades. If one survives, we tell the world, war is not glory. War is not flags or medals pinned to a uniform. It is sacrifice. It is agony. It is young men who risk everything and whose names are deliberately buried by history. 8 men flew into the unknown in 1942, delivering a powerful message of defiance. Only 4 returned home alive, and even they paid for their survival with scars no one could see, wounds that never truly healed. They were not heroes because they fought a battle they could not win. They were heroes because they endured a darkness they should not have survived. If you are watching this now, remember them. Seek out their names, because the only way a man truly dies, the only true defeat, is when his story is forgotten. His story is forgotten.